In 1974, a graduate student working through a basement catalog at the University of Pennsylvania published a slim dissertation that almost no one read. Attached to it, as a footnote to a footnote, was a partial translation of a clay tablet from Nippur, palm-sized, cracked along the left edge, one corner missing entirely. The tablet had been in storage since the late 1800s, excavated from a pit in what is now southern Iraq, cataloged, and filed alongside thousands of others that had not yet found their moment. It looked like every other fragment in the drawer, cuneiform pressed into clay in neat rows, a few signs damaged, a few lines incomplete. Scholars had classified it as part of a mythological poem, a story about a king and his friend, about loss and grief and what happens after death. The translation was treated as literary, symbolic, harmless. Then someone noticed the instruction set. Not what the tablet described, what it commanded. Specific behaviors, specific prohibitions. A list of things a person entering the underworld must not do, not as moral guidelines, not as poetic metaphor, but as operational rules for passing through undetected. And the reason those rules existed, stated plainly in the text, was this: the underworld could recognize intruders. It could identify them, and once it did, it kept them. That is not mythology, that is a system, and the tablet, it turns out, was only the first piece of it. The text in question is known to scholars as Gilgamesh, Enkidu, and the Netherworld, cataloged under ETCSL 1.8.1.4, assembled from more than 50 separate cuneiform fragments excavated from Nippur over the course of a century. The composite translation took nearly 50 years to reconstruct. Mainstream scholars classify it as one of 5 Sumerian poems about the legendary king Gilgamesh, part of the literary corpus that eventually became the Epic of Gilgamesh. The standard reading is clear, a narrative about friendship, loss, and cultural values. Gilgamesh loses his gaming tools, a ball and a stick, into the underworld. His companion Enkidu volunteers to retrieve them. Gilgamesh gives Enkidu a list of instructions before he descends. Enkidu ignores them. The underworld traps him. Gilgamesh appeals to the gods. Eventually, Enkidu returns briefly, reports on the condition of the dead, and the poem ends. That is the official reading. It works well enough until you look at the instruction set. The text gives Enkidu 37 specific behavioral rules before his descent. Do not wear clean clothes. Do not anoint yourself with fine oil. Do not carry a staff. Do not put on sandals. Do not throw a throw stick. Do not shout. Do not kiss your wife. Do not strike your wife. Do not kiss your child. Do not strike your child. The list continues. Each prohibition is specific. Each refers to an action, an object, or a sensory signal that would mark the descender as living rather than dead. Mainstream scholars explain this as symbolic ritual, a poetic act of self-humbling before the realm of death, a narrative device reflecting Sumerian funerary culture. The official explanation is rational, and it may well be correct, but it does not explain one specific detail. The text does not say that following these rules honors the dead. It says that following them prevents the underworld from noticing you. And the consequence of failure is not shame or bad fortune. The consequence is capture. Enkidu enters anyway. He ignores the rules. And what happens next is what mainstream scholars have struggled to frame cleanly for decades. Pages 206 to 221 of the composite text describe the underworld's response to Enkidu's presence. It does not simply hold him the way a locked room holds a person. The text implies something closer to recognition and retention, The underworld identifies him as an intruder and does not release him. When Gilgamesh appeals for his friend's return, the first god he petitions is Enlil, one of the highest deities in the Sumerian pantheon, a ruler of wind and divine authority. Enlil refuses. He will not intervene, not because he cannot, but because the system governing the underworld operates under what the Sumerians called the Me laws, divine decrees that even the highest gods were bound to observe. Enlil would not break them. Only Enki, the god of hidden knowledge, underground water, and wisdom, found a way. Enki did not break the rules. He found a gap between them, a passage opened through divine intervention that Enkidu used to return briefly before being pulled back. A system so locked that the king of gods declines to open it. That is either mythology or it is a description of architecture. Once Enkidu returns, the poem shifts into something that reads less like narrative and more like a field report. Gilgamesh asks him what he saw. Enkidu answers. Lines 244 through the end of the text describe the condition of souls inside the netherworld with a specificity that has made scholars uncomfortable for generations. The dead are stratified. Kings who died leaving many sons behind receive thrones, companionship, fresh food, and sweet water, sustained not by any divine reward, but by ritual offerings poured by their living descendants through clay pipes into the ground above. Those without heirs, without proper burial, without family members observing the correct rites, they eat dust. They lie in isolation. They suffer, not because of anything they did in life. Morality does not appear in this accounting. Virtue is irrelevant. What matters is only whether someone above them, still living, remembered to perform the ritual. The World History Encyclopedia, drawing on the primary text, states the condition of the Sumerian soul plainly, that it is completely self-aware and completely powerless once it has descended. Self-aware, fully conscious, remembering everything, and unable to act on any of it. That is not rest. That is not peace. That is not even punishment in a recognizable sense. What the text describes is something stranger than any of those. It describes permanent conscious confinement maintained not by chains or locks, but by rules governing a system that the soul cannot exit, cannot negotiate, and cannot appeal. And then the text introduces a detail that most discussions quietly move past. The Nippur manuscript tradition ends with a list of different types of souls and their conditions inside the netherworld. The list moves through the dead, the man with many sons, the man with few sons, the man who died in battle, the man who died childless, the woman who gave birth, the stillborn child. Each has a described condition. The list continues until it reaches the final entry: the man who died in fire, the man who went up in smoke. And his entry is different from all the others. It does not describe his condition in the netherworld. It states that his spirit is not in the netherworld, not suffering, not isolated, simply absent. He does not appear to have entered the system at all. Scholars debate what this means. Some argue it reflects a Sumerian cultural fear of cremation, a warning against a burial practice that would deny the soul its proper passage. Some call it a scribal anomaly, a line that does not quite fit the surrounding structure. Some argue it reflects a genuine ancient belief that fire destroys the Ur-Nammu, the Sumerian ghost soul, entirely, leaving nothing that can be retained. The official readings are reasonable, but the alternative framing is harder to dismiss than it first appears. If the netherworld is a system with detection capability and retention mechanics, and if one specific method of death produces a soul the system cannot process, a soul that does not appear in the registry, that generates no ghost, that simply vanishes, then the Sumerians were recording an exception. And exceptions do not appear in poetry, they appear in manuals. The story should have stayed with one tablet. Instead, it widened. Around 2094 BCE, a Sumerian king named Ur-Nammu died on the battlefield. He was the founder of the third dynasty of Ur, a ruler who built temples, reformed laws, and left his name on more inscriptions than almost any king of his era. After his death, a poem was composed, likely performed as part of the funerary rites by his son and successor Shulgi, that describes what happened to Ur-Nammu after he died. Not the funeral, the descent. Lines 76 through 197 of the text known as the Death of Ur-Nammu follow the king's soul into the Netherworld. He arrives. He brings gifts to the gods of the afterlife, to Nergal, to the figure of Gilgamesh, who by this period had already been absorbed into the mythology of the Underworld as one of its judges. A great banquet is held in his honor, and then the king laments. Lines 155 through 197 are not grief over death in any conventional sense. Ur-Nammu's soul is fully conscious. He knows who he was, he knows what he built. He knows the city of Ur continues above him, the walls standing, the soldiers marching. The temples he commissioned still receiving offerings he can no longer oversee. He knows all of it, and he cannot return to any of it. His lament is not spiritual longing. It is the specific suffering of a completely aware person who has been permanently removed from everything they possessed and cannot get it back. The mainstream reading places this in the tradition of Sumerian royal lament poetry, a genre used to memorialize kings and reinforce the importance of legacy and proper burial rites. That reading is not wrong, but if the poem is even partly grounded in what the Sumerians actually believed death felt like, then what they believed was not rest, not judgment, not transition. It was the permanent, conscious experience of having been sealed inside a system with no exit. Two tablets now, two different angles on the same structure. One describing the mechanism, one describing the experience from inside. Then the third tablet appeared and the architecture became impossible to ignore. Inanna's descent to the Netherworld, cataloged under ETCSL 1.4.1, is more than 400 lines long and was assembled from over 50 separate cuneiform fragments excavated since the late 1800s. The Akkadian version of this text, a later adaptation known as Ishtar's Descent, was the first to be discovered and translated in the 1860s. But the older, longer Sumerian version was invisible for decades. Scholars knew it existed in fragments, but the composite translation required approximately 50 years to reconstruct fully. The text that contains the most detailed description of what entering the Netherworld actually involves, the older version, the more complete version, the one that predates the Akkadian adaptation by centuries, spent half a century in pieces across multiple archive collections before anyone could read it whole. The text describes the goddess Inanna, Queen of Heaven, goddess of love and war, one of the most powerful figures in the Sumerian pantheon, descending into the Netherworld to challenge the power of her sister Ereshkigal, its queen. At the first gate, the gatekeeper Neti stops her. He removes her crown. She passes through. At the second gate, he removes her lapis lazuli necklace. At the third, her breastplate. At the fourth, her gold ring. At the fifth, her measuring rod. At the sixth, her royal breastplate. At the seventh gate, the final gate, he takes everything that remains. She enters the realm of the dead, stripped of every object, every symbol, every instrument of power she carried from the world above. The mainstream reading frames this as symbolic purification, the soul releasing its earthly attachments, the divine ego dissolved before death, a poetic representation of spiritual stripping. That reading is widely accepted and it is coherent, but place it next to the other two texts and a different shape emerges. In the Gilgamesh poem, the soul can be detected, and the rules for entering undetected involve suppressing sensory signals: clean clothes, oil, sound, the smell of life. In the Ur-Nammu poem, the soul inside is fully conscious but stripped of agency, aware of everything it possessed, able to act on nothing. In Inanna's poem, the entry process is sequential, gate by gate, each one removing a specific capacity or instrument. The stripping is not random, it follows an order. It removes at each threshold something that would allow the soul to act, communicate, or return. 3 separate texts, 3 separate stories, the same architecture underneath. According to one controversial interpretation, these 3 texts are not independent myths that happen to share imagery. They are, according to some alternative researchers, 3 perspectives on the same system. One describing how detection works, one describing what containment feels like, and one describing the entry process by which capacity is removed. Mainstream scholars reject this reading. The texts are understood as part of a shared mythological tradition, with common imagery reflecting common cultural beliefs about death, not a literal technical description of an actual structure. That mainstream position is reasonable, but then came the tablet that traveled to Egypt. In the diplomatic archive at Tel El Amarna, excavated beginning in 1887, archaeologists found a clay tablet written in Akkadian. It was dated to the 14th or 15th century BCE. It described the Mesopotamian myth of Nergal and Ereshkigal, the story of how a god descended to the underworld and became its co-ruler alongside its queen. The tablet was not found in Mesopotamia. It was found in Egypt. It had been sent there as a scribal school text, part of the diplomatic correspondence between the Egyptian court and the rulers of Mesopotamia. The same story, traveling west. Then, in 1951, a second version of the same myth was excavated at Sultan Tepe in southeastern Turkey. Oliver Gurney, emeritus reader in Assyriology at the University of Oxford, identified it in 1953 and published a full edition in 1960. 2 separate sites, 2 different centuries, 2 versions of a text with substantial gaps in both, and at the core of both versions, preserved intact across the distance and the time, the sealed underworld, the restricted exit, the single God who knew where the loophole was. Mainstream scholars read this as evidence of cultural diffusion, which is exactly what it looks like. The myth traveled with scribes the way myths travel. The imagery was adapted, as imagery is adapted. There is nothing unusual about a Mesopotamian story appearing in Egypt or Turkey during the Bronze Age, but what is unusual is what did not change. The structural core of the story, the sealed system, the entry process, the inability to leave, the one figure who found the gap remained consistent across cultures that should have adapted it more freely. When myths travel, they usually absorb local detail. They take on new god names, new landscapes, new moral frameworks. What is strange here is not that the story moved, it is that the operational structure inside it moved with it and stayed intact. The myth does not change its rules when it travels. The trap stays locked. The older, longer Sumerian version of Inanna's descent sat in fragments for 50 years before translators could reconstruct it. That is not conspiracy. It is the ordinary difficulty of working with thousands of damaged clay fragments in multiple institutional collections across several countries, with limited funding, limited access, and a scholarly tradition that until relatively recently treated mythological texts as lower priority than administrative records. The tablet N983, one of the Nippur fragments containing lines from the descent text, was published in 1974 in a PhD dissertation, not in a major journal, not in an institutional report. It was in a graduate student's thesis, which was then filed and largely overlooked. No one suppressed it. No one had to. They only had to stop asking what the last reconstructed line meant. And the last reconstructed lines of that Nippur tradition, the ones describing what each category of soul experiences inside the Netherworld, are where the text becomes most specific and where the official explanation becomes least satisfying. Because the text is not describing general conditions, it is describing a stratified system with specific inputs and specific outputs. What you receive in the Netherworld is not determined by your virtue. It is determined by whether your descendants maintain the correct ritual above your grave. The soul is the variable. The living are the operators, and the system runs regardless of either. Pulling back across all three texts, the Gilgamesh poem, the Death of Ur-Nammu, and the Descent of Inanna, a coherent structure appears. One text describes detection and the rules for avoiding it. One describes the inner experience of a conscious soul that cannot exit. One describes the sequential process by which capacity is removed at entry. Together, they do not read like three independent myths that happen to share imagery. They read like documentation of a single system from three different vantage points. Some alternative researchers argue that the Gala, the enforcement agents of the Netherworld, the demons who drag souls to Ur, were described in the ancient texts with an unusual consistency that goes beyond supernatural characterization. The Gala do not eat, they do not drink, they cannot be bribed. They are unmoved by weeping, by pleading, by the suffering of the souls they transfer. They have no function beyond transfer and retention. Mainstream scholars categorize the Gala as mythological demons, which they are. But the description in the texts is less like divine monsters and more like automated agents executing a fixed protocol. That framing is speculative, and mainstream archaeology rejects it entirely. The Me laws, the divine decrees governing the Sumerian cosmos, are understood by scholars as the conceptual framework of Sumerian civilization, not literal engineering specifications. The implication, if the controversial reading is taken seriously even for a moment, is something the text does not quite say, but seems to point toward. The rules governing the system were not discovered. They were given, and the Sumerians knew who gave them. The Anunnaki, the great gods of Sumer, are named in the Underworld texts as the authorities under which Ereshkigal rules and the Me laws operate. Mainstream scholarship treats the Anunnaki as a divine pantheon, which is exactly what the texts present them as. But some alternative researchers, working from Zecharia Sitchin's controversial and widely disputed translations, have argued that the Anunnaki were not symbolic figures, but remembered visitors, engineers perhaps, or survivors of something older whose descriptions were mythologized over generations until the original content was buried under accumulated religious interpretation. That argument is not accepted by mainstream scholars. It is not confirmed by any verified evidence. But if the Me laws were designed by someone, and if the system those laws govern was built rather than imagined, then the question of who built it becomes the most dangerous line in any of the texts. because the texts do not answer it. They only describe the system from inside it. The Nippur exception is still there, the man who burned, the soul that does not appear in the registry. Scholars have noted that this line may reflect a scribal tradition, a scribal anomaly, or a genuine theological category the Sumerians recognized as standing apart from the normal entry process. But place it alongside the Tibetan Bardo Thodol, which describes a 49-day window of consciousness after death, during which the soul can be guided or drawn back depending on what it recognizes. Place it alongside the Egyptian Amduat, which divides the soul's nocturnal journey through the underworld into 12 precise hours with specific dangers at each stage. Place it alongside the Egyptian Book of Gates, whose 7-division structure echoes the 7 gates of Kur, with a specificity that mainstream scholars attribute to independent mythological development. Across cultures that had no verified contact, the same structural logic appears: a soul that is conscious after death, a transition period with defined stages, a system with specific rules, and a narrow and difficult path that most souls cannot find. The mainstream explanation is that human beings everywhere face death and everywhere invent frameworks to explain it, and that the similarities reflect shared human experience rather than shared information. That explanation may be correct, but if it is mythology everywhere, the question that remains is why it reads in each place like a technical specification. New tools are being applied to these texts now. AI-assisted translation systems are recovering cuneiform lines that were too damaged or too faint for visual reading. Infrared and multispectral imaging are revealing marks on tablet surfaces that previous scanning technology missed. Satellite archaeology is mapping Nippur and Eridu and the sites of the great Sumerian temple complexes with a precision that surface excavation never achieved, identifying buried structures that match descriptions in texts once dismissed as poetic. The ETCSL project, the Oxford-funded digital corpus of Sumerian literature that remains one of the most comprehensive translations of these texts, has not been substantially updated in years. The composite texts it hosts were assembled from the best available scholarship of their era, which means that the Sumerian literature currently informing our understanding of what the ancient world believed about death and the soul may be incomplete, not because anyone hid something, because the tablets are still in pieces, still in drawers, still waiting. The original fragment, the one from Nippur, the one published in a dissertation in 1974. It is still in the Penn Museum collection alongside thousands of others. The composite text it belongs to was assembled from more than 50 such fragments, and some of those fragments remain only partially translated. The 37 rules Gilgamesh gave Enkidu, the detection avoidance protocols, the behavioral instructions for passing through a system that recognizes the living, are still in the text. They have not been explained away. The mainstream explanation remains: mythological poem, scribal tradition, cultural instruction about the importance of proper burial and family legacy. That explanation is possible. It may even be right, but it does not account for the mechanism. It does not explain why the consequence of breaking the rules is not misfortune, not bad omen, not spiritual failure, but capture, detection, and capture by a system that recognizes what does not belong in it. The soul that enters the Netherworld, according to these tablets, is not judged. It is not weighed against a feather, not measured against its deeds, not sorted by virtue or sin. It is retained, aware, powerless, recorded by name in a registry maintained by a scribal goddess inside the system. The soul knows who it was. It knows what it built, what it loved, what it lost. It simply cannot leave. and the only beings who moved freely between the world above and the world below were the Gala, the agents with no appetite, no emotion, no negotiable function. The only god who knew the loophole was Enki, the god whose domain was hidden knowledge. The tablet is 4,000 years old. The instructions are still in it. The system it describes has no moral dimension, no exit that ordinary souls can use, and no judgment that factors in how a person lived. The Sumerians were not describing heaven. They were not describing hell. According to some alternative researchers, they were describing something that has no comfortable name, a structure built for retention, not rest, for inventory, not peace. The mainstream explanation calls it symbolic. It may be right, but the symbol behaves less like metaphor and more like a diagram, and no one has yet fully explained why Gilgamesh knew to write the instructions down.